More than 900 years ago, an army marched across continents, driven by faith, fear, and the promise of salvation. They were knights, peasants, nobles, and soldiers. Men who had never traveled far from their villages were now crossing mountains, deserts, and seas. Their destination was a city unlike any other: Jerusalem, a place sacred to three religions, a place that had witnessed centuries of conquest, prayer, and bloodshed. But in the late 11th century, that ancient city became the center of one of the most dramatic conflicts in medieval history, a conflict that would later be known as the Crusades. To understand why tens of thousands of people marched toward Jerusalem, we must first travel back to the year 995. Europe at the time was a deeply religious society. The church held enormous power. For many people, faith shaped every part of daily life, and when the Pope spoke, kings and peasants alike listened. In November of that year, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd in the French city of Clermont. His message was urgent. He called upon Christians across Europe to take up arms and march east. The goal was clear. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control for centuries, but the Pope claimed that Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land were being threatened and mistreated. Whether exaggerated or not, the message spread rapidly. Urban II promised something extraordinary. Anyone who joined the expedition would receive forgiveness for their sins. For many people in medieval Europe, this meant eternal salvation. The idea ignited a wave of religious passion across the continent. Knights saw an opportunity for glory. Younger sons of noble families saw the possibility of land and wealth. Peasants believed they were answering a divine call. Soon thousands began preparing for a journey that would take them thousands of kilometers away from home. Crosses were sewn onto clothing and armor. Those who joined the expedition became known as crusaders. Their symbol was simple: a cross. Their goal was anything but simple. The journey east was long and brutal. Many crusaders had little experience with long campaigns. Some groups traveled through Eastern Europe, others passed through the Byzantine Empire. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly. Entire groups sometimes collapsed before reaching their destination, yet the movement continued to grow. By the time the Crusader armies reached the Eastern Mediterranean, they had become a massive force. But the Crusaders were entering a region already shaped by centuries of conflict. The Middle East at the time was politically complex. Different Muslim rulers controlled different territories. Power struggles were common. But despite these divisions, the arrival of large foreign armies created a new level of tension. One of the most important moments came in 1097. Crusader forces began capturing key cities along the way to Jerusalem. The siege of Antioch became one of the most brutal episodes of the campaign. The city was heavily fortified. The siege lasted for months. Food ran out. Soldiers starved. Desperation spread through the camps. But eventually, the Crusaders managed to break through the defenses. Antioch fell, and the road to Jerusalem opened. In the summer of 1199, the Crusaders finally reached the city they had traveled so far to conquer. Jerusalem stood surrounded by strong walls. Inside the city were Muslim defenders, along with Jewish and Christian communities who had lived there for generations. The Crusaders launched a siege. Wooden towers were built, ladders were raised against the walls, arrows filled the sky. After weeks of fighting, the defenses finally collapsed. Crusader forces poured into the city. What followed remains one of the darkest chapters in medieval warfare. Chroniclers from both sides describe scenes of mass violence. Thousands of people were killed. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with chaos and bloodshed. For the Crusaders, however, the capture of the city was seen as a divine victory. Jerusalem was now under Christian control. New rulers were installed. A series of Crusader states were established across the region. But the story did not end there. The capture of Jerusalem sparked centuries of continued conflict. Muslim leaders soon began organizing resistance. One of the most famous among them was Saladin, a brilliant military commander and political leader. In 1187, nearly 90 years after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, Saladin's forces defeated a Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. Shortly afterwards, Jerusalem returned to Muslim control. The news shocked Europe. It triggered new waves of crusades. Kings and emperors joined the campaigns. Figures like Richard the Lionheart would later march east in an attempt to reclaim the Holy City. But despite repeated efforts, Jerusalem would never again remain permanently under Crusader rule. Over time, the Crusades slowly faded, yet their impact on history was enormous. They reshaped political power in the Middle East. They transformed relationships between cultures and religions. They opened new trade routes between Europe and Asia. And they left behind stories of faith, ambition, courage, and tragedy. Today, the Crusades remain one of the most debated chapters in world history. Some see them as religious wars driven by devotion. Others see them as political campaigns disguised as holy missions. The truth is complex because the Crusades were not driven by a single cause. They were shaped by faith, by power, by fear, and by human ambition. Nearly 1,000 years later, the echoes of those events still resonate in the history of the modern world. What began with a speech in a crowded square in medieval France became a conflict that would reshape entire civilizations. And the memory of those wars continues to remind us how deeply belief, power, and history can become intertwined.